Hi everyone, today I'm going to share 21 things that I wish that I had known when I first started to crochet. Try everything. Regardless of what you think is going to be your favourite thing to crochet, I highly recommend trying a little bit of everything. Whether that's granny squares or garments or toys or micro crochet or lace work, give every different aspect a go, because you might be really surprised to find the thing that you enjoy making the most isn't what you expected. There is no right way to hold your hook. Whether you're a fan of the pencil grip or the knife grip, or you just do it your own way like I do, the most important thing is to hold the hook in a way that is comfortable for you for the long haul and enables you to use those fine motor movements that actually make the stitches. It doesn't matter if your friend or your auntie or your uncle holds their crochet hook in a different way to you and they tell you, oh, that's the best way. The best way is whatever works for you. Don't worry about what other people think of how you're holding your hook. Give a few different things a go if you're not overly comfortable, but if it's working for you, stick with it. Different fibres work up really differently. Now, if you've been crocheting for a while, then you'll be very familiar with this fact. But if you buy, for example, a DK weight yarn in cotton and you buy it in chenille, it's going to look phenomenally different when you work it up. And the same is even true between things like polyester and acrylic, and even the different types of wool. So wool from different sheep, different animals like alpacas, it all works up really, really differently. Texture matters. Now, I know it matters more to some of us than other of us, but texture really does matter. And it's not just if you're making clothing. If you're making toys, texture still matters. You want to pick up and get a certain feel for the toy when you lift it up when it's made. It's no good if you use a yarn that is a texture that you're not happy with. Texture matters, and it is okay to make a yarn choice based around texture, just in the same way as it is to make it based around anything else. Yarn washing instructions vary wildly. Don't assume just because you've had a previous acrylic yarn, even of the same brand, that was okay to machine wash at a certain temperature, that another acrylic yarn is going to be the same. Every single time you get a new yarn, check the washing instructions before you try and wash it. The same yarn weight does not mean that it's the same thickness. When we say yarn weight, we do mean thickness. We mean the number of strands within it. And on a basic level, you can break it down like that. However, you can have a chunky yarn or a super chunky yarn or an Aran yarn, and you can have them made up of different fibres or even just from different manufacturers, and the thickness of those strands of yarn will differ from yarn to yarn. Don't assume just because the yarns that you've picked up all say worsted weight on them that they will all have the exact same thickness of strands. They quite possibly won't. It's a good ballpark, but it's not an exact science. Use stitch markers liberally, and they don't need to be shop bought stitch markers. They don't need to be the little claspy plastic ones or the little fancy metal ones. I often just use scraps of yarn to mark stitches, but if you think that it might be helpful at some point for you to mark that stitch, mark a stitch. Use them whenever you have the impulse to use them. It can only ever be of benefit. Granny squares are the best thing to learn on for some people. It's with really good intention that a lot of people, myself included, throw around the statement that granny squares are the best thing to start on, and I think probably for the majority of people they really, really are. They are simple in their most simple form and repetitive. However, not everybody has the personality that gets on with repetitive. Some people need to learn things that have much more differentiation to them, or that come out with a different product, and that is fine. If you're trying granny squares as your very first thing because granny squares are the best thing to learn on, and it's not doing it for you, it doesn't mean that you're not a crochet person. Might just mean you're not a granny square person. Colour palettes matter. When you're beginning a project, or even just putting together creative ideas for a project, or choosing a pattern that you're going to follow, or designing your own pattern, the colours that you choose can make or break the thing that you are creating. However you break it down, think about the colours that you're using. If you're using more than one colour, set those yarns in a pile in front of you, mix and match, move them around, and make sure that they are cohesive before you start the project. It really makes a big difference. You don't have to use the same yarn weights within a project. Now, if you're following someone else's pattern and you want it to turn out exactly like their thing turned out, then absolutely stick to what they're suggesting. However, there is leeway within most things that you produce, as long as you plan it carefully, to use slightly different weights of fibre. And what it will do is it will change the structure, and it will change how the stitches stand out and how they come together. And I frequently, within my patterns, use different fibres within the same thing, for example, to make nice patches on animals that I create. But I do also occasionally use different weights of yarn together, particularly on blankets, because it can make a really nice texture. So don't be afraid to experiment with that. It's okay to quit a project. There is a term for unravelling what you've done, it's frogging. And it doesn't matter at all if you get halfway through something, or even 3/4 of the way through something, and you don't like it, or you think you've done something wrong, or it's just not your thing. Never worry about quitting a project. If you doggedly pursue trying to do something that you are not enjoying, or you're just not feeling, all you're going to do is put yourself off crochet. And we don't want that. We want to keep enjoying our hobby and keep doing it. Again, it's fine to stick it in a box, store it, come back to it 6 months later, see if you feel differently, or to just unravel it and reuse the yarn. If it's usable for another project, brilliant. If not, old yarn makes great stuffing for new projects. It is always fine to go, this one's not for me. You can have a style without realizing it. This is a really funny thing that came up for me only recently, because on my website Lucy Kate Crochet, where I share my patterns, my friend Sarah also produces patterns there too. And she used to just make stitch guides and advice for crocheting, and now she designs this amazing range of toys as well. And it really made me realize that my patterns have a style to them. When you browse through the website, you can really distinctly see who made what, which is fantastic. If you're designing your own things, I think that if you look at a collection of things that you've made, you might find that you had a style without even realizing it, which is pretty cool. Non-crafters will not appreciate the time that went into your work, and that's okay. Please don't be hurt or offended like I have been a couple of times over the years when I've created something for someone and they've gone, oh, that's lovely, thanks so much, without very clearly appreciating that it took hours of my life to put it together. It doesn't mean they don't appreciate you, and it doesn't mean that they don't think that the thing that you made was wonderfully appropriate or totally beautiful or really practical. It just means they don't craft. And if you decide that you don't want to crochet things for people who don't have sort of an empathy for how long it takes, that's totally fine. But it's also fine to just accept that they don't get it, but you made an awesome thing and you can still feel really proud of that. Take your time. I am so bad for rushing things and for wanting to do things as quickly as I can, and for wondering how quickly I made that last granny square and whether I can make it ever so slightly faster the next time. And that's really fun if that's your thing. But the faster you go, the more inconsistencies tend to creep in, and the more mistakes you are likely to make, and potentially the less enjoyment you're going to get as well, especially when you're new, especially when you're learning new techniques. Stay at a reasonable pace and you will probably get a lot more enjoyment and learning opportunity out of what you're doing. Try to learn one new thing every project. Now that doesn't mean that it's not fine to occasionally do a new project that's a bit more challenging, that has a couple of different new stitches in it, but in my experience, if you try to pick a pattern of someone else's that you're following that has one thing that you're really unfamiliar in it, it's enough to drive your interest and keep you learning without putting you off through over complexity. It's a great way to learn, and if you want to keep expanding your crochet vocabulary, as it were, your techniques list, there's a word for that somewhere, isn't there? Then doing one new thing in each new project that you do can be a great way of achieving that. Listen to advice, but take it with a pinch of salt. It's so hard sometimes when you know what you're doing and you know where you're at, and someone comes in and tries to give you a helpful piece of advice and it doesn't feel helpful because you feel like you already knew it, or it's not relevant, or they're interfering. I may be projecting my own feelings onto you here, but advice I wish that I'd had as younger crocheting me: just listen to them, take it in, absorb the bits that might be useful to you, and politely thank them for their time. There's no harm in listening to other people's advice, and some of the time when I've started out feeling like, why are you telling me a thing I already know, I've ended up learning something incredibly useful in the process, and remind me to take this advice into the rest of my life as well, because I'm really bad at that. Not every project will turn out how you wanted it to. You finish a project and you sit back and you stare at it and you realize that you put the safety eyes on wonky, or you pick up the jumper and it just doesn't fit. Not everything is going to turn out the way you want, and you can get frustrated and annoyed and furious with yourself, or you can go, hey, that's another thing learned. And yeah, that's annoying. It is annoying to all of us, and it still happens to me now. I still sit back and go, oh, that's not quite how I wanted it to look. I made a whole new toy design recently that I feel that way about. I'm just not sure about it. And it didn't give me the feeling that I wanted it to when I'd finished it, which was a real shame. But I've been in this game long enough now to go, deep breath, okay. I'm going to set that to one side and I'll look back at it in a month's time and I'll see if I still feel like it's not worth publishing on the site or whether it is. It happens to the best of us. Not every project turns out how we want it to. Everything is shapes. Sounds strange, but bear with me. So mostly what I make is crochet toys or amigurumi, and all of the basis of all of my designs is this concept of looking at an animal and turning them into basic shapes. And imagine it as circles, triangles, rectangles, cylinders, and then put them together. That's the whole basis around which I design crochet toys. And when you look at a new project and you see it initially in your mind even just as shapes, I think if you've not done it before, you'll be really amazed at how much easier it is to compile that together. Not everybody is going to like the same thing. Again, that sounds obvious, right? But to me, it was a little bit of a surprise. Occasionally I'd come across a pattern and I'd show it to somebody and I'd be like, wow, isn't this gorgeous? And they'd be like, all right. And in the same vein, they might find a pattern and send me a link to it and go, wow, isn't this amazing? And I'd go, okay. Just because you think that something is amazing, don't automatically assume that everybody else will. And this actually only matters if you're making stuff as gifts, because if you're making something for you, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. But just, you know, it's a thing to keep in the back of your mind that I probably wasn't overly aware of to begin with when I was first learning, is that not everybody's gonna like the same thing. And finally, the final thing that I wish that I knew at the beginning is that I will never stop learning. There will always be a new stitch or a new technique or a new design style or a new thing to explore. This is a wonderful hobby for so many reasons, but one of them is that I could crochet every day for the rest of my life, however long that may be, and I would never stop learning something new. So whilst it can be difficult sometimes to be a beginner at something that seems so huge, know that even those of us who have been neck deep in this for years and years are still learning too. We're all learning together, and I don't know about you, but I really like learning stuff. But how do you feel? What do you think? What advice would you give your crochet beginner's self if you went back in time or sent a message through time? And what advice was given to you when you were first learning that really stuck with you? I'd love to hear it. Let's have a chat in the comments section below, and I'll see you there. Happy crocheting!